Hi, this is Andy. When my wife and I were preparing to be foster parents years ago, we had to go through some training. And I'll say we went into this training rather skeptical. I mean, after all, we already had three kids that were early to mid teens. What could these classes possibly teach us? Well, during the training, the topic of attachment came up a lot. And personally, I thought it sounded like a lot of psychobabble, honestly. But as the training went on, and as we went further into our journey of being foster parents and eventually adopting our youngest two kids, I got to tell you, I have a whole new appreciation for the role that attachment plays into just about everything. Now, if I'm you, I might be wondering, why are we talking about this on a podcast focused on helping you improve your ability to lead and deliver? Well, you know what? I get pitches about books just about every day. And when I was approached about a new book coming out about attachment, I was just about to give the standard rejection, but then I thought back to that foster training. Even if you share the skepticism that I had back then, could it be there are some ideas that could help you and me become more effective leaders here? Well, you're about to find out. Dr. Judy Ho is the author of a new book entitled The New Rules of Attachment. Judy's a clinical and forensic neuropsychologist, and one of her primary specialties is helping people gain insight into the roots of their mental health and life struggles. But you know what? She goes beyond identifying the problems they're currently experiencing to discover why these problems are happening in the first place. And here's my take. We're all trying to do our best to lead our teams and projects while navigating our lives and careers. Could it be there are factors that, if we understood them better, could make a marked difference in our day-to-day experience with others? I think so. And this is one of those episodes that I hope will spur you on to look into this whole area of attachment in more detail after we're done. In today's discussion, you'll get a better understanding of what attachment is and why it's relevant to our roles. You'll learn more about attachment styles and how they impact us at work and at home. And Dr. Judy will share some common leadership pitfalls or blind spots that we might be struggling with because of our attachment styles. We'll talk about all that and so much more. I can't wait to share the discussion with you. Hey, but first, if you've been listening for a while, you know about our course, AI Made Simple, right? I mean, it's a practical guide to using AI in your everyday work. Well, reviews keep coming in about how people are finding the class so helpful. If you haven't already gone through the course, I invite you to join other listeners from around the world who are using these tools to save them time. Learn more and join us at ai.peopleandprojectspodcast.com. Thanks. Well, let's jump into today's discussion with Dr. Judy Ho about her book, The New Rules of Attachment. Dr. Judy, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Andy, for having me. And so interesting to hear about your own journey in terms of how you discovered attachment and found it to be interesting and relevant for you.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for featuring me on your episode today. I really appreciate it.
I've been looking forward to this, and it was. I think it was clear from the intro. I was very skeptical, and so those who are listening, if they feel that, I'm glad they're listening. In fact, let's start with this. I mean, how do you explain what attachment is? Since I think there's limited understanding of that, and why is it so crucial for our audience of leaders to understand that?
Yeah. So first, Andy, you and I have something in common in that I found very much attachment theory in general to be a little skeptical as well, because during my training years, I was really focused on being that here and now psychologist. Like, okay, let's solve the problems of today. So like, yes, your past, but like, can we not dwell on your past and just figure out what we can do today? Exactly. But all the time that I was doing these here and now work with people who are leaders, who kind of want that solution, they're perfectionists, they're go-getters, they're like, I need to find the solution now. Everything kept coming back up about the past. Everything kept coming back up about what they experienced before and how that formed who they were. And really that all goes back to attachment. So I would say that I'm a reluctant, adopter of attachment theory as something that's so fundamental. But to your first question, how do we explain attachment and attachment theory? So at its most basic level, attachment is a fundamental aspect of human development that has a huge impact on our overall well-being throughout our lives. And at this most basic level, attachment refers to the first emotional bonds that form between you and your primary caregivers. And this first crucial bond is designed to keep you alive and thriving during a time when you can't possibly care for yourself. And because of that, it sets the stage for the development of who you are and what you believe, particularly about yourself, as well as how you'll interact with other people.
Yeah. You just think about, it's one of those things where you have so little control in those days, and yet those early days affect it. And, you talk about the styles. you talk about the styles. I'm curious, what is your primary attachment style, and how does that influence how
Yeah.
you lead at work and at home?
Oh, definitely. Well, I mean, I think that now, because of all of the self-development work and really having insight, I would like to say that most of the time I'm operating from a secure attachment
Hmm.
style.
Hmm.
But the shadows of my avoidant attachment style will creep up from time to time. So I think that probably in the past, especially had more of an avoidant attachment style. And we can get into like what that really looks like when you're at work and in relationships. But essentially, I was kind of like this proverbial lone wolf. I was very, very independent, like really valued that over many other things. Like when things were troubling me or stressful, I really didn't ask for help. I just kind of rolled up my sleeves and did everything myself.
Okay.
And on the outside, I think that that looks maybe even to some people a little admirable, like, oh, great, like you're able to do that. But really, at the end of the day, that's a form of self-sabotage in and of itself, because we are social beings and we need to stay connected to others to be able to achieve everything that we need to achieve. And also, our self-concept can't just be based mostly on one thing. So a big part of my self-esteem and self-concept was really rooted in my career and my achievements in my career. So I was kind of this quintessential workaholic, and I still feel like that person in many ways, but maybe just not leaning into it all the time and really being able to be more balanced in my overall approach. And I found that to actually benefit my career overall, as well as my relationships with people.
I feel like from the book, you make it clear that it's not just these styles aren't designed to just put you in a box and you're always that and only that. You might have you spill over to other
Right.
ones. There's times where it feels like when it comes to elements of personality like introversion, extroversion, that it's not if you are, it's when you are. And like
Yeah,
in this setting, I am more this, and that's
exactly.
it. Is there some truth to that when it comes to these styles as well?
100%. Yeah. And I would say that, some of my earliest experiences really did help pave the way for a generally secure attachment style for myself. But I did find that, in my career, generally, I was pretty secure attachment style, in my self development, same. But I think it was more about those more intimate relationships with people where you really have
Mhm.
to trust somebody and lean on them. That's where I became a little bit more avoidantly attached. I was really happy to be there for people when they needed me, but when I needed help, I never asked for it. So
Yeah,
that's just one example of it from the
that's
people in
good.
my life who I should be able to trust. These are my family members, my best friends, my romantic partners, etc. And still have struggles with that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because when I answered the attachment style quiz, it reminded me of how good my childhood really was. Like
That's
I hadn't
awesome.
really thought through some of that, and yet I know that's not something everyone listening to us can say. And what strikes
Right.
me is that something we have no control over in our infancy can impact us for years afterwards. But if I understand in your book correctly, that's really how it happens. The beliefs we
Right.
internalize as a child, they persist, they influence throughout our life, right? So what hope is there for someone listening who didn't have the conditions that in some ways you had and in many ways I had as well for a secure attachment?
Right. Right. And again, like you said, this is a time when we really didn't have very much control of our environment. This is the way that we're made as human beings. That's why all babies are so cute, because you have to be cute so that the adults in your lives want to take care of you, because you need to be taken care of. Like there's literally no way to survive without these adults in your life, right? At that age. And so, yes, you don't have a lot of control. And I think that it's sort of a difficult thing to walk away from when you understand that, like, oh no, well, what does that mean then? And now it's coloring how I go about my life. And like you said, is there any hope? And the idea, of course, behind it, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't
Exactly.
believe this,
Yeah.
but is yes, there's hope. There's hope at any age. It doesn't matter how old you are. I've literally worked with people to unpack their attachment styles and get the life that they want in their 60s and 70s and even 80s. So it's any age and any stage of life. And even if those early caregivers who maybe had a role in how your attachment style developed are not available to do the work with you or don't want to do the work with you, you don't need them to. The whole point is that now, as your adult self, which has many more coping skills, is much more in control and can affect different outcomes in your own life, you're able to heal those broken parts of your childhood and to reshape the way that you think about yourself and how you go about the various areas of your life.
I seem to recall there was somewhere in your book you said, if there's one thing you take away from the book, it's that. Right? If there's
Yeah.
one thing you can take away, we're not just explaining your past, but you actually, there's ways to get through it. And despite us not getting a lot of training on this, I feel like I didn't learn anything about this in university, or I I haven't seen training classes in the workplace on attachment theory. But what we do get is we do get emotional intelligence and psychological safety. So I'm just curious, how do attachment styles relate to EQ and psychological safety? What would you say?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, attachment style really has a lot to do with whether or not you can develop your emotional intelligence. And the reason is people who have secure attachment style, they tend to feel more free in expressing all of the different parts of themselves. So, not just when things are going well, but also being able to name and deal with negative emotions and thoughts that come up. Obviously, it doesn't mean that their lives are perfect, but it does mean that when the going gets tough, they're more able to identify at the core what's going on and then essentially apply the coping strategy that's going to work best for that situation. So they're still going to struggle, but they're going to get to that effective coping strategy a lot faster than some of the insecure attachment styles. And the ability to be able to even name how they're feeling.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, when people have insecure attachment, they have this phenomenon that we psychologists call alexithymia. So that's just a really fancy way of saying, you don't feel right, but you can't quite identify what it is. Like I've worked with people who their favorite word to describe a negative emotion is just frustrated. I'm frustrated. It's like, okay, but what else aside from frustration? Is it anger? Is it sadness? Is it disappointment? And it's like, at some level, they've just cut themselves off in terms of being able to relate to that emotional part of themselves. And if you can't do that for yourself, then it's harder to do it for other people. Even if you feel like you're an empathetic person, it's just harder than to identify somebody else's state of mind if you can't even identify your own, right? So that's how it relates to EQ. And then this idea of psychological safety. So I know that we talk about fight or flight mostly in the form of how it relates to your physical safety. And of course, that's ultimately important. We need to survive, right? To kind of keep going, not only for our species, but for ourselves. But because we're such social beings and our socialization is so innate and crucial to our overall survival, when we feel psychologically not at rest, when we feel psychologically threatened, it basically has the same effect on our bodies and our minds. So the fight or flight gets pushed up just as if we were being hunted by a bear. It's like the things of common day, which is, well, what if I apply for this job and I get laughed out of the interview room or don't even get the interview? Or, if I do start this project and nobody cares, nobody comes to my business, these little self doubts that seem little actually have an impact on our overall psychological safety and can enact that fight or flight response. And in general, insecure attachment styles, they just have more of a proclivity towards that. They tend to not feel psychologically safe. So they do certain things, whether it's avoiding or people pleasing or overworking or not knowing what coping style to go to, that actually prevents them from being at a state of more chronic and persistent psychological safety.
Yeah, it makes total sense. So, I mean, I haven't asked you to actually say what the styles are. So maybe as a way to understand it, how about some common leadership pitfalls, or we maybe would call them blind spots that leaders might have with each of the different styles?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So there's three different insecure attachment styles. There's the avoidant insecure attachment style. There is the anxious insecure attachment style, and then there's finally the disorganized insecure attachment style. And by the way, this all came up. These attachment styles were identified by Mary Ainsworth. She was a researcher who essentially put these studies together of infants and toddlers and how they tended to respond with their primary caregiver in the room, with a stranger while their primary caregiver was there, when their primary caregiver left and it was just them and the stranger. And then finally, when the primary caregiver returned to the room, how did these babies react? Like, were they happy to greet their parents? Were they upset with them and stayed upset for a long time? Or were they kind of a mixture of different things? And so these are the early studies that helped us to identify these attachment styles. And so when we talk about the avoidant attachment style, this is in terms of the blind spot for the leader, because they're the quintessential lone wolves, they're fiercely independent. Sometimes they will prioritize projects, tasks over relationships with people. And so in a haste to get things done, they prioritize that, and they prioritize thoughts and logic oftentimes over emotional experience, which of course, as a good leader, you have to be attuned to what the people that you're supervising and working with, they need, right? So maybe they're people just like you, and like they really jive with your leadership style and your priorities. But then there's those kind of people who, if you don't actually connect with them a little bit on the emotional side, or really get more personal with them on certain aspects of what they're doing, they can't really work at their best for you, and they can't be invested in the same way that you would like them to. And so that's, I think, a very, very common blind spot. And also trying to do everything yourself instead of delegating properly. Those are the blind spots of the avoidantly attached. The anxiously attached individual, this is somebody who tends to have more difficulty with not considering everyone's emotions. And they really have a hard time sometimes making that snap decision because they have an issue with people pleasing, whether or not they recognize that about themselves. And one of the things that I think with insecure attachment of the anxious type is that they tend to maybe sometimes try to make everyone happy, which of course is not possible, or sometimes they'll second guess their decision making, so that sometimes it just takes them way too long to get to a certain place, and then they start to prioritize those relationships and how people feel about them rather than the decision itself.
So I think I can recognize some of the anxious attachment in my early career. And so I don't think it has to come with age. I don't think it, because age and maturity don't always walk hand in hand, I suppose. But it is interesting how I can see some of that for sure, of the need to please people early on. But it is yeah. So the reason I bring this up is I really am wanting the people listening to us to like, which ones of these do I think I hit? So let's hit the next one.
Yeah, definitely. And the last one is disorganized attachment. So this is the style where, again, this idea of kind of constantly being in fight or flight tends to be the most prominent for this style. And so they kind of switch from coping strategy to coping strategy. There's no one way that they tend to respond. So I would say that, from a leadership perspective, the blind spot that oftentimes, at least outside observers, are seeing is that their decision-making seems a little erratic and maybe sometimes even impulsive. And they have a much harder time trusting that other people are going to really do what they say. And so because they expect inconsistency in other people, they actually end up being inconsistent themselves. And so that makes it hard for other people to respond to them because they're not really exactly sure how they're going to react to anything, right? And so that can definitely cause some disturbances in the working relationships as well, just because you're more likely to get in conflict with people over various types of things.
That's interesting. And I could be totally wrong about this, but it seems like the secure attachment, or at least somebody who spends a lot of time in that, could have blind spots as well, right? Like to me, it seems that a potential blind spot would be, well, everyone else must be like me. It's like, what's the problem? Just
Right.
Why are you taking this so hard? Or you know what I'm saying? Is that a potential blind spot?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that sometimes securely attached individuals, depending on who they're in important relationships with, who they're working with, then they can get pulled to one side or another also, so even when you have secure attachment style, if you're working oftentimes with people who have avoidant attachment, then it's going to change the way that you relate to them. So that's one of the blind spots, is that they can feel pulled sometimes to different places. And also, as we mentioned, secure attachment style, it's not mean in any way that you're just the perfect leader or that everything goes well. It's really about, understanding that all of it is a balance. So when people are securely attached, one of the blind spots that I notice, other than being pulled to whoever they're working with from time to time, is that sometimes they feel like they have to be the most stable one for everybody else around. And that's just not possible all the time. You shouldn't have to shoulder all of those responsibilities. And yet sometimes people with secure attachment, they'll take it upon themselves to feel like they have to fix it for everyone else. And that, of course, is a pitfall, because that leads to burnout, and you just can't be everything for everyone and for every project and task all the time.
No, that's for sure. How does someone's attachment style influence their self-concept? And I'm wondering if there's some implications that has for their career and how they lead.
Oh, absolutely. So this is one of the things that I think is a misunderstanding about attachment styles. When you see it in popular media, when you see it on social media, online articles, usually it mentions how attachment style relates to romantic relationships and how you might be in those situations. But the whole idea is that attachment relates to everything. It relates to how you approach your career. It relates to how you experience friendships and how you interact in your family relationships and how you even go about your own wellness, physical and mental wellness goals. And so most of all, it shapes your idea of who you are. So self-concept is formed through a combination of experiences. This is really all about, what you think of yourself, your perceptions, your thoughts, your beliefs, your feelings, your attitudes, all of that is part of your self-concept. And this is formed through a lot of different experiences throughout your life, social interactions, cultural influences, anywhere from family background, peer groups, education and work experiences, as well as your exposure to media messages. And so attachment forms your self-concept and is actually one of the first seeds for your self-concept because, again, you're experiencing attachment at those early years of life when you're just learning about how the world works, how people react to you when you express a need or a want. And at this time, you're essentially a blank slate, soaking everything up. And so these early experiences, they really cement themselves into your consciousness. It's like, because you've had these experiences at this early age when you're trying to learn everything about the world, those lessons tend to stick with you a lot more than maybe something that happens to you in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, because you can write that off as, oh, well, it was just this person, or it was just this experience, or just this time in my life. But when something happens at that early age, you start to think, well, that is me, and you hold on to those beliefs a lot more. And it's amazing how it still continues to impact us years after, even when those situations and circumstances have changed. And it's just because of the way our brain works. We tend to do better with assimilating information into our existing beliefs rather than accommodating new beliefs that might require you to essentially rework these ideas about yourself. And even if those ideas are negative ideas, it just tends to be tackier and stickier in our minds rather than these new ideas.
Yeah. I just have to think that from a career perspective, we could self-limit. I could never, or at some level, I don't deserve to, or,
Right.
I imagine that's some of the self-sabotage that you covered in your book. But I don't know. I think it's fair to say most of us listening aren't trained neuropsychologists, right? But as we seek to interact with those who we lead, can you think of some clues? Let's say that they're not going to take a survey quite yet anyway, but some clues to their attachment style that we could maybe watch for, and then maybe some adjustments that could help performance?
Yeah, definitely. So I do have the access to the attachment styles quiz at my website. So you guys can go there and grab that. It's free. But in case you just kind of want a quick preview without taking the quiz, a few things to watch out for. When we think about how these attachment styles tend to show themselves up in your life, I talk about these ideas of self-statements, these things that you say to yourself over and over again. They're basically, a fancier term for them is called working scripts. So it's like the way that you've developed your understanding about yourself and the world, and they kind of show up in these truncated but overly broad rules or beliefs that can kind of play out in all these different aspects of your life. So each of the attachment styles have different self-statements that accompany them. So when we think about the avoidant attachment style, some of the most common self-statements are, I'm only as good as my last achievement. That's a common belief of people with avoidant attachment style. Also, another common self-belief for this style is really having a hard time with essentially understanding and believing that other people are going to be there for them. So another self-statement is, I must be in control at all times. So again, this high need for control. And then another self-statement that tends to be a part of the avoidant attachments consciousness is keeping others at arm's length. So, again, that idea of not really wanting people to help, not wanting people to be there to actually help them solve problems or even see the more vulnerable parts of themselves, because you're not really trusting that people will handle that with care. That's another common self-belief. And then I think when we kind of think about the last self-statement that I've noticed in avoidant attachment it's when the going gets tough, I go it alone. So the more challenging something becomes, the more you kind of sink into yourself and decide that you're not going to let anybody in. So those are some of the most common for the avoidantly attached. For the anxiously attached, their self statements are, I need to rescue everyone. This idea of yeah, like doing all for everybody else. There's also a self statement of fearing being on their own sometimes, especially for too long of periods. And so I fear being on my own is another common self statement. Another self statement that happens with the anxious attachment style is I have to analyze everything. So everything's up for debate in their minds. You have to overwork something in your head before you do something. So that can kind of take a little longer for them to pull the trigger on certain decisions that might require them to make decisions quickly. That's another common thing that they struggle with. And then another self-attachment, self-statement for the anxious attachment is really having a hard time like separating who they are from other people. And so maybe having a lesser defined line of where they begin, where they end, and where somebody else begins. And so this can lead sometimes at kind of its more severe end to more codependent behaviors and decision making. Really making sure that somebody else is doing okay before you pull the trigger on something. Yeah. With the disorganized attachment style, they have their own set of self statements again. And again, with the disorganized attachment style, a lot of times what they're struggling with are things like, maybe I deserve to suffer. Maybe I deserve bad outcomes. That's a common self-statement. I can't control my emotions. My life is in constant chaos. And then sometimes this push-pull behavior, especially in relationships with people, like I hate you, but don't leave me. So they have a lot of conflicting feelings about important people in their life.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, let's just drill in on the anxious one. Like, let's say someone's like, man, the way you describe that, there's someone on my team who's like that. Can you think of just, and no technique or approach is going to work for everybody. You're always, you interact with an individual, not a style, but can you think of one thing you might want to do if you're in a leadership position, you have somebody who you think is more of the anxious attachment?
Yeah, definitely. So the key to that is giving them that interpersonal support that they need. Like they really crave reinforcement from you and they want to hear that they're doing a good job. But the more you do it, the more they're going to be essentially handicapped by it because then they're always going to be looking for that instead of being able to kind of just carry on without that kind of level of frequency of reinforcement. And so it's about reinforcing them, but also giving them the basis for really believing that they can also carry on without your reinforcement and kind of reinforce themselves, right? And so it's this idea of giving them that positive reinforcement, but maybe not constantly, maybe not every single day. And then in between, basically saying, well, why don't you try to self-evaluate? Like tell yourself, ask yourself, like, how did I do today? Like, what are like the things that I feel most confident about that I did carry out and did finish today? And then what are some things that I wish I could improve upon? Like teach them that skill of self-reinforcement and self-evaluation as opposed to always having to rely on the messaging of their supervisor or their peers.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, before I started my company, I had this offsite with a coach. He was the former head of HR at a Fortune 100. And I wasn't sure what he's going to do, but we were in a ballroom and he just wallpapered the whole side of it. And he goes, all right, what's your earliest memory? And I'm like, I don't know, a bright light, and I screamed. I don't know, I wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he kept asking. And over the next hours, we walked through my life, and he was looking for memories, events, kind of like turning points, maybe some clues along the way that might help inform my decision of starting a business. And that reminded me when I read your Life at a Glance timeline exercise. So how do you describe that exercise and how have you found it to be helpful with people?
Yeah, so Life at a Glance, I love this exercise because it gives you this bird's eye view of how you view your life. What are the most important events? What are the things that you take stock of that you feel like had the most impact on you as a person? So when everybody does this exercise, it can really come up very differently in terms of how they even define, the most important events of their life, first of all, but even how many events they put on their timeline. So when I've done this in a group format, for example, like as a group therapy or like a workshop exercise for companies and teams. It's so interesting. Like sometimes people will put just 10 events on their timeline. Then there'll be somebody next to them who's writing 40 or 50, or even just the content of the timeline. Are they mostly putting things that relate to their career and their work as opposed to relationships or self-development areas? What do they tend to focus on when you ask them, hey, give us a portrait of your life and what's the most important in it? And it's always interesting when you go through it, when you review it and say, well, why was this important to me? And what else is missing from this picture? What do I have too much of, right? And so those questions, I think, really help people to understand themselves, not only how their self-concept is formed, because that has a big relationship to that, but also when the going gets tough, how do they heal themselves? How do they self-soothe? How do they do that so that they can move on to the next day and to the next project? It's really interesting because some people, when they get stressed, like they work harder. It's like a workaholic mentality of like, let me just go right back into work. And that's obviously not sustainable over the long run. Or when things get stressful, do some people just say, you know what, I can't handle this and I'm just going to go away. Like they use escapist coping strategies and they just kind of back away from all the things that they have to do in their life. And so it's really important to know that about yourself and know kind of where your pain points are so that you can actually intervene and become the best version of yourself.
Yeah, I like that. And that's just one example of the exercises in your book. And there's so much more that we could talk about, but let's end with this. Besides reading your book, what practical steps can our listeners take to understand attachment better and apply its principles for their benefit and for their teams?
Yeah, well, I think that the most important thing is to know that even though attachment sounds like, well, is that really complicated and how do I really translate that? It's really about the practical solutions, right? You want to understand how these things formed in your past, but really it's about how do we address what's going on now and how do you reach the goals that you have for yourself in your future? And so the most important thing I think for people to walk away with is that it's all about the practical tools once you get that insight. So you get the insight, you form that insight. That's important. That's important for self-understanding. But to really make it work for you, it's about these specific tools, things that you can actually do today to unpack that and to effectively be the best version of yourself at work and in relationships and in any other area. Like, how are you showing up? And so my book goes into a lot of these specific strategies, things that you can do today within a few minutes, start to kind of put into your daily workouts and your, self-care routines so that you can show up better. It's really all about clearing cognitive space, especially when you're stressed. Sometimes when we're stressed, it feels like there's a million things coming at us. And it's just clogging up our ability to actually make the best decisions because our cognitive resources are finite. It's like our physical resources. Like you can't just keep running without rest, right? So it's the same idea. But when there's too many ideas clogging your mind, you can't really multitask. And multitasking is a myth anyway. It's not really like you can multitask well. It's really about switching between tasks and it gets exhausting. And so I think what happens is these unhealed attachments, they definitely, add to that clogging of your brain. And so it's really about learning these practical strategies to clear up your mind so that you feel the most effective when you come up to a stressful situation and you can say, aha, but I know exactly how to approach this in a way that's going to move my life forward, my team forward, rather than taking a huge step back or making things more complicated for yourself.
Just the way you described that, Judy, it just made me think of people who are leading projects. They feel like they're juggling so many things and that cognitive space is just crowded. So for those listening, if you've resonated with this discussion, get a copy of Dr. Judy Ho's book, The New Rules of Attachment. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So Judy, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy.